too much noise today. I just need the road, the rain, and the hum of the engine.
I used to think something was wrong with me, like maybe I was just too different to ever really fit in. I'd be in a room full of people hearing laughter, small talk, stories flying back and forth, and still feel like I wasn't there, like I was watching it all happen from the outside, trying to find a place in it, but always a beat too late or a layer too deep. It wasn't that I didn't care. I did. I do. But while others seemed to enjoy the rhythm of casual conversation, light, fast, looping around nothing in particular, my mind was somewhere else. Always analyzing, always reaching beneath the surface. It's not that I didn't want to connect. I just couldn't connect that way. For the longest time, I mistook this for a flaw. I blamed myself for not trying harder to blend in, to just relax and have fun. But here's what I've come to understand. Some minds are wired differently. Not better, not worse, just deeper. And with depth comes a certain kind of solitude. Not chosen, not always welcomed, but inevitable. The more I learned, the more I saw. In people, in systems, in my own emotions. And with that seeing came distance. Because once you start noticing the undercurrents, the motives behind the smiles, the cracks behind the masks, it becomes harder to participate in the play without constantly questioning the script. I used to think I was broken for not enjoying things the way others did, but the truth is I was just tuned to a different frequency, and I think many people are, whether they admit it or not. That sensitivity to thought, to feeling, to subtlety, it's a gift, but it's also a weight, because when you sense more, you feel more. And when you feel more, you carry more, often silently. There were moments I envied those who seemed so at ease with the world, chatting freely, drifting between social circles, never overthinking every word or glance. But I also noticed something else. In the quiet of their own minds, some of them were just as lost. Only instead of looking deeper, they kept moving faster, as if staying busy could drown out the questions. That's the paradox, isn't it? Intelligence, real, searching intelligence, doesn't just crave answers. It creates questions. And those questions don't always have tidy conclusions. They lead you inward. They pull you away from the crowd, not out of arrogance or fear, but because the crowd doesn't always have the language for what you're trying to understand. I remember nights lying awake, not from stress or noise, but from thought, like my brain wouldn't let go, constantly dissecting, connecting, wondering. There's a kind of loneliness in that, being the only one in a quiet room while your mind feels like a stadium of voices. And yet, that solitude has given me some of my most profound moments of clarity. It's in those still hours that I've come closest to understanding who I really am, beneath the roles, the expectations, the noise. I think many of us are taught to fear solitude. We associate it with rejection, with failure, with emptiness. But for people like you and me, it's often the only space where we can breathe, where we can sort through the chaos of perception and emotion, and finally hear ourselves think. It doesn't mean we don't value connection. In fact, we value it so deeply that we can't settle for surface-level bonds. We crave truth, depth, resonance, not just presence. And that kind of connection is rare. It's not found in loud rooms or big crowds. It's found in quiet corners, in late-night talks, in the spaces where we feel safe enough to be raw. I don't think being alone makes you broken. I think it means you're listening to yourself, to the world, to something most people are too busy to notice. And yes, it can hurt. Feeling like a stranger in familiar places, like your mind is both your sanctuary and your exile. But it also means you're awake, you're alive, you're searching for something real. And honestly, that's brave. There were times when being alone felt like exile, like I'd somehow failed to participate. You know, there's something incredibly powerful about choosing solitude, but there's also something deeply painful about it. It's the difference between seeking a quiet room to think and being shut out of the world, left behind because you don't fit. I've often wondered if this was the choice that the great minds made, those who seemed to disappear into themselves, who left behind traces of brilliance in their wake, but couldn't quite keep up with the world around them. Einstein, Tesla, Schopenhauer, these were people who, in many ways, rejected the very thing society tells us we should crave: connection. Not because they didn't need it, but because their minds required space to breathe. And that space, as it turns out, is often lonely. I've come to realize that this kind of loneliness, the one born of thought, of reflection, of deep awareness, isn't a weakness. It's the birthplace of creativity, of innovation, of change. Without that solitude, without the quiet to nurture new ideas, how could anything truly original emerge? The world around us is loud, cluttered, demanding, and it can be so easy to get lost in it, to drown in the noise and the constant distractions. But when you retreat, when you allow yourself the space to breathe, without the pressure to conform, that's when something extraordinary can happen. Of course, the loneliness isn't always comfortable. There's a price to be paid for deep thought and high sensitivity. Sometimes it feels like you're on the outside looking in, surrounded by people who just don't see the world the way you do. And that's okay. It's not that they're wrong. They just haven't had the same experiences, the same reflections. Their conversations flow over the surface while yours sink deeper into the unknown. And that gap, it can be isolating. But what I've learned over time is that this loneliness is a space of its own, a fertile ground where real growth happens. It's a space where I've found my truest thoughts, my deepest desires, my most authentic self. And when I embrace it, when I stop resisting the silence, it becomes less of a burden and more of a gift. It's not empty. It's rich with possibility. The silence allows you to hear your own voice, to understand your own thoughts, without the distraction of the outside world. The trouble, of course, is that the world doesn't always appreciate this. We live in a culture that celebrates connection, that prizes extroversion, that rewards constant engagement. And for people like us, who find peace in solitude, this can feel like a constant uphill battle. Society doesn't always know what to do with people who don't need the crowd. It labels them as antisocial, weird, or worse, depressed. But I've learned something important. Solitude is not the same as isolation. Solitude is a choice, an intentional retreat for the purpose of growth, clarity, and renewal. Isolation, on the other hand, can be a reaction, a retreat born of rejection, of feeling misunderstood, or of being too tired to fight the world. The trick, I think, is to understand the difference. There's no shame in needing time to yourself, in finding your center in quiet places. But there's also a danger in letting that quiet become too permanent, in letting it close you off from the world entirely. Because while solitude can spark creativity and insight, it can also keep you from sharing those insights with others. And that's where the balance becomes so important. You can't grow in a vacuum. Even the most brilliant minds need to connect with others, to test their ideas, to hear other perspectives, to challenge themselves in ways they can't do alone. I think that's where the beauty of deep, meaningful connection comes in. It's not about being surrounded by people all the time, or about constantly talking and socializing for the sake of it. It's about finding the right people, the ones who can meet you where you are, who can engage with your thoughts on a level that feels real. When you find those people, it's like you're able to step out of your isolation just for a moment and breathe in a way that makes sense to your soul. And this, I believe, is the key to inner peace. Not trying to fit into a mold that doesn't suit you, but finding a way to live in harmony with both the solitude you need and the connections that nurture you. It's not about choosing one over the other. It's about learning to dance between them. There's strength in solitude, yes, but there's also strength in shared understanding. It's the balance of both that leads to a fuller, richer life. I think maybe the loneliness isn't something to fear. It's something to understand. It's a space to cultivate, to nurture, to turn into a foundation for your most authentic self. But don't let it turn into a wall. Don't let it separate you from the world, because after all, the world needs your unique perspective. And sometimes the world will surprise you with connections that you never saw coming, relationships that make you feel understood and seen in ways you never thought possible. There's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution to the tension between solitude and connection. But there is a path forward, a way to honor both your need for inner space and your need for genuine, meaningful relationships. It starts with knowing yourself, understanding why you crave solitude, and then learning to balance that with the kind of connections that make you feel alive. It's a journey, one that takes time and patience, but I think it's worth it. It's strange, isn't it? How society teaches us from such a young age what normal is supposed to look like. Be friendly, be outgoing, join the group, smile more, speak up, blend in. And if you don't, if you're quiet, thoughtful, introspective, people assume something's wrong, that you're shy, or cold, or broken. I remember being that kid who loved to sit quietly and watch. I didn't feel the urge to jump into every conversation or compete for attention. I liked thinking, I liked listening, but that wasn't celebrated, it was questioned. Teachers would say I needed to participate more. Adults would ask if I was feeling okay, and classmates, well, they just assumed I didn't want to be part of things, and honestly, after a while, I started believing them. I thought I should be louder, I should be more talkative. So, I tried. I copied the behavior of the kids who seemed to thrive in the spotlight. I forced myself into roles that drained me, all because I thought that's what being normal looked like. But the more I pushed myself to be what I wasn't, the more I felt like I was fading, like I was living someone else's life, wearing a mask that smiled while my true self quietly disappeared in the background. I came home exhausted, not from work or school or activity, but from pretending, from performing. And I didn't even realize it until years later. You see, the world is designed for extroverts. The loudest voice often wins. The most visible person gets the credit. And if you're not constantly networking, posting, talking, doing, people assume you're falling behind. But what they don't see is the quiet power that builds in silence. The strength it takes to know yourself well enough to not chase validation. The courage it takes to say, no, I'd rather stay in and read when the rest of the world calls that boring. Carl Jung spoke about this, how trying to be something you're not leads to emotional exhaustion. He called it living out of alignment with your true nature. And I've felt that misalignment in my bones. That moment when you realize you've been living on autopilot, following someone else's blueprint for success, for happiness, for connection. And none of it fits. It's heartbreaking, honestly, because there's a grief in pretending. You mourn the time you lost trying to be someone else. And then, slowly, you start reclaiming yourself. You remember the things that once brought you peace. Quiet mornings, deep books, one-on-one conversations that actually mean something. You stop apologizing for needing space. You stop questioning your rhythm. You begin to trust it. But the pressure never fully goes away. Even as adults, we're praised for being social, energetic, adaptable. Rarely are we taught to honor our stillness, our depth. The world doesn't hand out awards for introspection, but that doesn't make it any less valuable. And so we have to unlearn a lot. We have to stop measuring our worth by how well we fit in and start measuring it by how deeply we live in our truth. That's not easy. It means saying no to things that everyone else says yes to. It means missing out on moments that look shiny on the outside, but feel hollow to us on the inside. It means feeling like an outsider, sometimes even in our own families or friend groups, because we see and process the world differently. But here's the thing. There's nothing wrong with being different. In fact, there's something profoundly right about it. There's a reason some of the most brilliant minds in history were misunderstood. They didn't conform, not because they couldn't, but because they refused to trade authenticity for acceptance. And you don't have to either. You don't have to be the loudest voice in the room to be heard. You don't have to be the life of the party to be loved. You don't have to pretend to be energized by what drains you just to be normal. You are allowed to need quiet. You are allowed to crave meaning. You are allowed to exist at a slower, deeper pace and still be enough. I'm not saying this like I've mastered it. Honestly, I still catch myself slipping into the old patterns sometimes. Overcommitting, forcing conversations, doubting my natural rhythm. But I'm more aware now. I know when I'm abandoning myself for approval, and I can gently bring myself back. There's this beautiful strength in knowing who you are, even if the world doesn't always understand you, even if it never fully does. Because when you stop fighting yourself, something amazing happens. You make space for people who do see you, people who value your depth, your thoughtfulness, your need for real connection. And those relationships, they're worth the wait. So if you're someone who's always felt like the odd one out, if you've ever wondered why the world feels too loud, too fast, too shallow, just know you're not alone. There are others like you, quiet souls, deep minds, gentle hearts. We're scattered, but we're here, and you don't have to change to be seen. You just have to keep being real. Some days it feels like everything around me is turned up too loud. The lights too bright, the conversations too fast, the expectations too high. It's like walking through a world that never stops buzzing. And all I want is to find a quiet corner to breathe. I've always felt things a little more intensely than others seem to. A tone of voice could shift my entire mood. A crowded room could drain my energy in minutes. Even joy, when it came, arrived like a tidal wave, full of meaning and complexity. For a long time, I didn't have a name for that. I just thought I was fragile, too sensitive, easily overwhelmed. But then I started to understand. Some people are just wired to feel more. Carl Jung believed that the more conscious a person becomes, the more deeply they experience the world. Its beauty, its pain, its contradictions. And when you feel everything that deeply, the world doesn't just touch you. It moves through you, constantly. That kind of sensitivity can be a gift, but it's also exhausting. Imagine a radar that never turns off, constantly picking up on people's emotions, unspoken tension, subtle energies that others breeze right past. It's not something you control. You just absorb voices, glances, atmospheres, even when you're trying not to. And while that awareness gives you insight and empathy, it also wears you down. Sometimes I wish I could be one of those people who can spend an entire day in meetings, happy hours, group chats, and still go out at night laughing like they've just woken up. I envy that resilience, that ease. But I know that if I don't pull away, if I don't unplug, I start to fade. It's not about being antisocial, it's about survival. Because for people like us, people with deep inner worlds and high sensitivity, overstimulation isn't just annoying, it's debilitating. Too much sound, too much talking, too many emotions that aren't ours but that we feel anyway. It creates this inner static, thoughts get tangled, emotions overload. The mind starts spinning without rest. And the only way to stop the spiral is to step away. But stepping away doesn't mean shutting down. That's something I had to learn. There's a difference between retreat and escape. The first is healing. The second is hiding. And for a while, I couldn't tell which one I was doing. I'd cancel plans not because I didn't care, but because I had nothing left to give. I'd avoid group settings because I knew I'd be reading everyone's body language, catching undercurrents of tension, and carrying emotions that didn't even belong to me. I'd feel guilty, like I was letting people down, like I was failing at being a good friend or a normal adult. But really, I was just protecting my peace, my energy, my mental clarity. You know what's strange? Once I started honoring that need for rest, real rest, the kind that comes from solitude and silence, I actually began to enjoy people more. Not all the time, not every setting, but in ways that felt sustainable. I'd come to a conversation with a full cup, not a cracked one. I could listen without feeling overwhelmed. I could share without feeling exposed. I think that's the irony. Society pushes us to be constantly on, constantly connected. But for those of us who are wired more inwardly, that pressure backfires. It burns us out. It turns us into shadows of ourselves. And then we wonder why we feel empty when we've given so much. So now I try to do things differently. I build in space. I say no without apology. I leave parties early or skip them entirely. I take long walks alone. I write. I sit in stillness, not because I don't value people, but because I finally value myself enough to give my mind what it needs to thrive. I've learned to listen to the cues, that tension in my shoulders when the noise gets too much, that foggy feeling after too many back-to-back conversations, that subtle dread when I realize I haven't had a moment to myself in days. Those signals used to feel like failure. Now they feel like wisdom. And maybe that's the lesson here, that sensitivity isn't something to fix, it's something to understand, to work with, to shape your life around, not in a way that isolates you, but in a way that honors your nature. Because when you embrace your sensitivity, you unlock a different kind of strength, a strength that doesn't shout but senses, that doesn't push but perceives, that doesn't dominate but deeply connects. You start building a life that fits you, not the life you were told to want, not the pace everyone else is running. Your life, one that makes space for rest, for thought, for quiet power. And from that place, real connection becomes possible. Not forced, not performative, but honest. And that kind of connection, it doesn't drain you, it nourishes you. There was a time when I thought pulling away was the solution, when the world felt too overwhelming, too performative, too loud. I'd retreat, not just to catch my breath, but to shut it all out. I thought solitude was the answer to everything, and for a while, it worked. It was safe, predictable, controlled. But then something changed. The silence, once comforting, began to feel heavy. Days would pass, and I wouldn't talk to anyone, not out of bitterness, but because it was easier. No awkward interactions, no explaining myself, no pretending, but also no real moments, no shared laughter, no unexpected warmth, just stillness. And while stillness can be sacred, it can also slowly become a wall you build around yourself. At some point, I realized I wasn't retreating to heal anymore. I was retreating to avoid. Avoid disappointment, misunderstanding, that hollow feeling of trying to connect with someone who doesn't quite see you. And if I'm honest, that avoidance gave me a sense of control. But control isn't the same as peace. Carl Jung once warned about this, the danger of retreating too far into the self. When introspection becomes isolation and self-protection becomes a cage, it's subtle. You don't even notice it at first. You just stop reaching out. You stop hoping for connection. You convince yourself you're better off alone. And maybe in some ways, you are. But something begins to wither. That part of you that longs to be understood, to be met, starts to dim. And what's even trickier is that from the outside, it can look like strength. People say things like, "You're so independent," or "You don't need anyone," and at first it feels empowering. But deep down, you start to wonder, is this resilience or resignation? I remember sitting with that question one evening in a quiet apartment after another week of working, thinking, writing, and not really talking to anyone in a meaningful way. I told myself I was thriving. I had my books, my thoughts, my space, but something in me felt hollow, not broken, not lost, just incomplete. Because the truth is, no matter how deep your inner world is, we all need to be witnessed sometimes. Not praised, not entertained, witnessed. We need someone to hear the tremble in our voice, to notice when we've gone too quiet, to look at us and say, "I see you, I get it." And when that doesn't happen for too long, we start to shrink inside. We begin to question if our thoughts matter at all, if our presence means anything to anyone outside ourselves. That's when I understood. Solitude is powerful, but it's not the whole story. Yes, it's where we heal. Yes, it's where we find clarity, but we're not meant to stay there forever. Even the most thoughtful insights need air. They need to be spoken, shared, challenged, and expanded. Otherwise, they can become distorted, self-confirming loops that never evolve. The deeper risk of isolation isn't just loneliness, it's stagnation. When there's no exchange, no one to reflect back, to question, to stretch us, we stop growing. We become so sure of our inner reality that we start mistaking it for universal truth. That's when the line between wisdom and self-deception gets blurry. And this part hurts to admit, but I've fallen into that trap before, believing I was somehow above the noise, that my solitude made me purer, deeper, more aware. But looking back, that wasn't insight. It was fear dressed as superiority. I wasn't choosing solitude out of strength. I was choosing it to avoid being hurt again, because connection is risky. You have to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to be misunderstood, to feel awkward, to not have control. And for someone who thrives on clarity, on internal stability, that's terrifying. But it's also necessary. Growth doesn't happen in a vacuum. And transformation doesn't come from endless introspection alone. It comes from the friction of being in the world, of bumping up against other minds, other hearts, other ways of seeing. That's where insight becomes wisdom, where ideas become alive. So now I try to step out again, gently, slowly, not in ways that drain me, but in ways that challenge me to stay open. I reach out to people I trust. I show up even when it's easier to stay home. I listen even when I don't fully understand. And I allow myself to be seen. Not always perfectly, but honestly. It's not about abandoning solitude. It's about using it as a foundation, not a fortress. A place I return to, not a place I hide. Because the point of deep thought, of self-awareness, of shadow work, it's not just to understand myself. It's to live more fully, to love more honestly, to show up more completely. And that can only happen in the presence of others. There's this quiet ache that builds when you've been alone for too long. Not just physically alone, but unseen, unmet, untouched in the deeper ways that really matter. I've felt that ache many times, and for a long time I didn't even know that's what it was. I just thought I was tired or distracted or maybe even broken. But looking back now, I see it for what it was. The longing for resonance. Not company, not chatter, but resonance. You can be surrounded by people and still feel like you're vanishing. You can talk all day and still feel unheard. Because not all connection is equal. And for people like us, the reflective, the sensitive, the seekers, we don't just want to connect. We want to feel understood. But the world doesn't always offer that easily. There's a kind of grief in that realization, a soft, slow heartbreak that comes from reaching out and not being met with the same depth, from asking big questions and getting small answers, from offering your thoughts, raw, unfiltered, and receiving blank stares or polite nods in return. It's not that people don't care, it's that they often don't know how to meet us in those places. It's not where they live. And yet, we keep hoping. We keep hoping that somewhere, someone will hear the real question beneath our words. That someone will answer not just with logic, but with presence. That someone will sit with us in the unknown, without trying to fix it, explain it, or rush past it. Just be there. And when we don't find that, it's tempting to give up, to close off, to settle into the belief that maybe I'm just meant to be alone. But here's what I've come to believe. Connection isn't about finding many people. It's about recognizing the few who see you clearly and making space for those bonds to grow. And to do that, we need to stay open, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. For a while, I convinced myself I didn't need anyone, that I was fine on my own. And in some ways, I was. But in other ways, I was starving, not for attention, but for intimacy, the kind that comes from shared understanding, from mutual depth, from conversations that feel like home. I've had glimpses of that, moments with friends, or even strangers where something just clicked, where we bypassed the small talk and landed somewhere real, talking about fears, about purpose, about the strange beauty of simply being alive. Those moments are rare, but they're real. And they remind me that connection is possible, that I'm not too much, that I'm not alone in wanting more. But here's the part that surprised me. Sometimes I found that connection not by talking, but by listening, by letting go of my need to be understood first, and choosing instead to understand. By asking different questions, slower ones, deeper ones, the kind that invite people to drop their guard, not because they have to, but because they want to. And in doing that, I realized something beautiful. Many people do have depth. They're just afraid to show it. They've been told that vulnerability is weakness, that silence is awkward, that softness is naive. And so they armor up. They perform. They stay on the surface. Not because that's all they are, but because that's what the world rewards. But when someone creates a space that feels safe, when someone stays curious without judgment or hurry, those walls begin to fall. And suddenly, you see what's underneath. A mind that thinks in spirals, a heart that's been bruised but still beats with hope, a soul that's just as hungry for meaning as yours. I think that's our role. Not to chase people, not to demand understanding, but to model the kind of presence we crave. To live with honesty, to speak with depth, to listen with our whole being, and to trust that the right people, the ones who are ready, will feel that energy and respond. It won't be everyone, it might not even be many, but it will be enough. So if you've been feeling like no one sees you, like your thoughts are too tangled, your feelings too vast, your mind too different, please know this: you're not too much. You're just waiting for the right kind of mirror. And sometimes the way to find it is by being that mirror for someone else first. Connection isn't always instant. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it requires patience, discernment, and the courage to stay soft in a world that often celebrates the opposite. But when it happens, when two people meet in truth, it's like the whole world pauses, and for a moment, everything makes sense. There's this quiet ache that builds when you've been alone for too long. Not just physically alone, but unseen, unmet, untouched in the deeper ways that really matter. I've felt that ache many times, and for a long time, I didn't even know that's what it was. I just thought I was tired or distracted or maybe even broken. But looking back now, I see it for what it was. The longing for resonance, not company, not chatter, but resonance. You can be surrounded by people and still feel like you're vanishing. You can talk all day and still feel unheard. Because not all connection is equal. And for people like us, the reflective, the sensitive, the seekers, We don't just want to connect. We want to feel understood. But the world doesn't always offer that easily. There's a kind of grief in that realization, a soft, slow heartbreak that comes from reaching out and not being met with the same depth, from asking big questions and getting small answers, from offering your thoughts, raw, unfiltered, and receiving blank stares or polite nods in return. It's not that people don't care, it's that they often don't know how to meet us in those places. It's not where they live, and yet we keep hoping. We keep hoping that somewhere, someone will hear the real question beneath our words, that someone will answer not just with logic, but with presence, that someone will sit with us in the unknown, without trying to fix it, explain it, or rush past it, just be there. And when we don't find that, it's tempting to give up, to close off, to settle into the belief that maybe I'm just meant to be alone. But here's what I've come to believe. Connection isn't about finding many people. It's about recognizing the few who see you clearly and making space for those bonds to grow. And to do that, we need to stay open, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. For a while, I convinced myself I didn't need anyone, that I was fine on my own. And in some ways, I was. But in other ways, I was starving. Not for attention, but for intimacy. The kind that comes from shared understanding, from mutual depth, from conversations that feel like home. I've had glimpses of that. Moments with friends, or even strangers, where something just clicked, where we bypassed the small talk and landed somewhere real, talking about fears, about purpose, about the strange beauty of simply being alive. Those moments are rare, but they're real, and they remind me that connection is possible, that I'm not too much, that I'm not alone in wanting more. But here's the part that surprised me. Sometimes I found that connection not by talking, but by listening, by letting go of my need to be understood first, and choosing instead to understand, by asking different questions, slower ones, deeper ones, the kind that invite people to drop their guard, not because they have to, but because they want to. And in doing that, I realize something beautiful. Many people do have depth. They're just afraid to show it. They've been told that vulnerability is weakness, that silence is awkward, that softness is naive. And so, they armor up, they perform, they stay on the surface. Not because that's all they are, but because that's what the world rewards. But when someone creates a space that feels safe, when someone stays curious without judgment or hurry, those walls begin to fall, and suddenly, you see what's underneath. A mind that thinks in spirals, a heart that's been bruised but still beats with hope, a soul that's just as hungry for meaning as yours. I think that's our role. Not to chase people, not to demand understanding, but to model the kind of presence we crave, to live with honesty, to speak with depth, to listen with our whole being, and to trust that the right people, the ones who are ready, will feel that energy and respond. It won't be everyone. It might not even be many, but it will be enough. So if you've been feeling like no one sees you, like your thoughts are too tangled, your feelings too vast, your mind too different, please know this: you're not too much. You're just waiting for the right kind of mirror. And sometimes the way to find it is by being that mirror for someone else first. Connection isn't always instant. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it requires patience, discernment, and the courage to stay soft in a world that often celebrates the opposite. But when it happens, when two people meet in truth, it's like the whole world pauses, and for a moment, everything makes sense. There's a quiet kind of power in realizing that you don't have to choose between solitude and connection, that it's not either or, but both and. For the longest time, I didn't believe that. I thought if I embraced my need for space, I'd lose my chance at closeness. And if I chose closeness, I'd have to abandon the stillness that kept me sane. But life isn't built on extremes. It's built on rhythm. And the older I get, the more I see that true freedom lies in learning your own. Sometimes that rhythm pulls me inward, into silence, into thought, into long stretches of time where I don't want to speak to anyone, not because I'm sad or angry, but because I'm full of questions, ideas, reflections that need time to settle. That solitude nourishes me. It makes me sharper, more grounded, more me. And then other times, that same rhythm pulls me outward, into a phone call that lasts hours, into an unexpected conversation with a stranger, into a laugh that leaves my chest lighter. It reminds me that I do need others, not constantly, but deeply, not many, but real. For people like us, the thinkers, the feelers, the ones who process the world slowly and thoroughly, life is not about always being surrounded, nor about always being alone. It's about integrating, about honoring the parts of us that crave introspection and the parts that long for connection. That's what Jung was really getting at with individuation. It's not about cutting yourself off from the world to find yourself. It's about returning to the world with a clearer sense of who you are. Not to impress, not to conform, but to contribute. To give from a place of fullness, not lack. Because as much as solitude can heal, too much of it can distort. It can convince you that you're safer alone, that no one can understand you, that the world has nothing to offer you, and that belief, it's a slow poison. It seeps in quietly and convinces you that disconnection is wisdom, when really it's fear wearing a clever disguise. I've been there. I've gone so deep into my own world that I started to believe it was the only place worth being. But then something small would shake me. A kind message, a thoughtful question, a glance that held real attention. And I'd remember, oh, I'm not alone in this. There are others who feel deeply, who think in layers, who ache for meaning. They exist, and more importantly, they're looking too. The challenge is staying open enough to find them, not by shouting, not by chasing, but by being willing to show up as you are. That's the real risk. Not isolation, but openness. Being seen in all your complexity and trusting that someone will stay and some won't. That's part of it, but some will. And when they do, something extraordinary happens. Your solitude doesn't vanish. It deepens. It gets mirrored, understood, held by another. You don't lose yourself in the connection. You expand within it. That, I think, is the most beautiful thing of all, when solitude and connection are no longer at odds, when your quiet inner world becomes a place you can share, without apology or explanation, when you can move between silence and conversation with ease, when your life is no longer about choosing sides, but about honoring your nature fully. So if you've ever felt caught between the desire to be alone and the need to be loved, just know, you're not broken, you're not indecisive, you're learning your rhythm, and that rhythm is yours to protect, to trust, and to live by. You get to define what connection looks like. You get to choose when to speak and when to be silent, when to reach out and when to retreat. That is your power. Being alone doesn't mean you've failed. Sometimes it means you're just listening more closely to yourself, to the world, to what really matters. And when the time is right, you'll know when to come back. Not because you have to, but because you want to.
If this felt meaningful to you, it might mean something to someone else too. So hit like, leave a comment, or subscribe. That's how YouTube knows to share it with others. Maybe together, we can help someone see things a little differently.